Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're starting the book of Ruth. We did do the overview last week, but this is for June 4th, 2023, but you can listen to it anytime that you want, even years later. And so we're in the book of Ruth, verse 1, chapter 1, and I'm entitling this Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things. Most of us are just humble people going about our business, raising our families, uh, doing the everyday things that people do, mowing your lawn, taking care of your garden, going to work. But then we spend a lot of time raising our family and trying to make our way in life. And there's extraordinary news items on TV and the radio, and you kind of monitor it, but you almost can't watch too much of that. And ordinary people, it was several years back, and a dear lady had invited my wife and I to it was either Christmas or Thanksgiving dinner, and it was hosted by an Amish couple and their several daughters, and it was right in their home, and there was gas lights, and they served a sumptuous meal and all, but they didn't have any electric. And I got to thinking about it, and these people, they just raise their family, they cook their meals over gas stove, they don't have electricity, they don't even have a radio, they don't have a newspaper delivered to their house. They just go about their business, living their life, and whoever's president or not, and whatever's happening in the world, it really doesn't affect them. They're just all about family and faith. And I got to thinking to myself, maybe I ought to simplify my life a little and not look at the news so much. It'll just go and do what it's going to do. My God is King, and I'll just concentrate on Him and everyday life. After all, I'm just a little cog in a big, big, big wheel, and I don't make errors about things. And back in the time of Ruth, there were unassuming people living during a very dark time, and this serves as a window to spiritual victory during that very dark time. It says here in verse 1 of chapter 1, "Now it came about in the days when the judges governed, that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of the 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband." Okay, so this was happening during the time of the judges. They didn't have kings. There was no King Saul, no King David. Those lines hadn't even started yet as far as a kingship. And so they had judges. And to give you a little bit of a background of the time of the judges, says here in Judges 2:8 through 23, Then Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They lived a little longer back then yet. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. All that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them. Now, this generation that they are talking about just passed away. They're the ones that were born during the wilderness wandering, that 40 years. And they went out and picked up the manna. They drank water from that rock that followed them around in the desert. They were the ones that saw all the walls of Jericho fall down. They were the ones that passed through the Jordan River, that stood up like a pile on the side, and they went through on dry ground. They are the ones that got circumcised in the land. And then they started with Jericho, and then they did the battles in the middle, and they conquered a good portion of the land. They were able to have all these great victories, and they were ruling, so to speak, with Joshua, and Joshua and them passed away. They had known Moses and heard the preaching. They had been at Mount Sinai, most of them. And so these people, this great generation, passed away. And they were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. What? They didn't know the Lord? Weren't their parents believers? Isn't it automatic that they would be believers? Hey, every church that we have in the United States of America is one generation from apostasy, because your children got to get saved too. It's not automatic. It's maybe one of the hardest things we do is to get the next generation saved. And it says here in verse 14 of Judges chapter 2, Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. That's the lords of the land, the gods that were there in the land supposedly. And they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. Oh, I remember, didn't the Lord say something about, Thou shalt have no other gods before me? 10 Commandments. That wasn't really ingrained too much in them, I guess. So they forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtaroth. That's the female counterpart in the pantheon of gods they had. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of the plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had spoken, as the Lord had sworn to them, so that they were severely distressed. Then the Lord raised up judges, who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after other gods, and bowed themselves down to them. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do as their fathers. When the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved in pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. But it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers in following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not uh, abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of these nations which Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it as their fathers did or did not. So the Lord allowed those nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. Well, that's a long passage, but it does in fact tell you that they turned away quickly from God and following his ways. Then they'd grown and they'd come to God, at least superficially. God would take pity upon them, raise up a judge, and then they'd have peace. And then after the judge died, they'd quickly turn away and worship the Baals again. They wouldn't put these practices fully away. And then they'd cry again to the Lord, and they'd raise up another judge. Now, some of these judges you have heard of are Othniel and Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson. Eli is talked about in 2 Samuel, 1 Samuel, and then Samuel was like a judge, and then the king started, and Saul, his line didn't work out too well, so they raised up David's line. And so this is very, very interesting, all these things that happened. This was the time in which they were living. It was an up and down time. Some say there was a cycle of 7 ups. That's a drink, isn't it? 7 ups and downs over a space of 350 years. Oh, that's kind of hard to relate to, 350 years. You know, in 2077, see, our country started in 1777. And so in 2077, we'll have only been in existence in the United States for 300 years. This is 350 years. And so the time of Ruth, we can't be exact about this, but it might be about the time of Gideon, at least perhaps in that time zone. Which was about 1150 BC approximately. And during this time of the judges, this 350 years, there were at least 10 wars and 1 civil war. They say, well, wow, that was a very turbulent time. It seemed like they were having a war every whipstitch. And how do we relate to that as the United States of America? How could we relate to that? Well, it's kind of interesting. I'm glad you asked that question. You know, like I said, we haven't been in existence 300 years. And if you go to before the Revolutionary War, there was the French and Indian War. Then there was the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, many Indian wars, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, Desert Storm. Then you had Iraq and Afghanistan, that's 9/11. During that time, there was Cold War, and oh yes, there was a civil war. So isn't it interesting? There is a list of 12, 13 wars in a period of 300 years. That's kind of interesting, kind of parallel, isn't it? And yet it was squeezed a little bit more into a 300-year period, whereas this was 350 years. But there was always seemed like every generation, about every 30, 40 years, they'd have some type of major war. And the United States always seems to be getting into some major war. During my lifetime, the Korean War, then you had Vietnam War, then you had the Cold War, you had Desert Storm, you had 9/11. Of course, you had the Cold War that was going through that. And those things affected our lives. I remember after 9/11, church was filled. We had area prayer meetings, and pastors would come and pray every Tuesday for about an hour and a half. And so it united us and got people to thinking about salvation and what truly was great. So the people did during this time as they pleased. It says, men did what was right in their own eyes. And here was a man named Abimelech, and he decided that he was going to leave the land. God went to all this trouble to get him into the promised land, and he decided it wasn't all that, and he needed to go someplace else. And they went over into the Transjordan area where the Moabites lived, and they sojourned there some 10 years. And yet, from this crucible of famine and difficulty and wars and ups and downs and things like this, there came 3 unassuming people daring to trust God and become an anchor for a family and a community and a faith. Their names were Naomi, Boaz, and Ruth. And they followed God. They determined they would do things God's way, even if it might be painful or difficult. They determined they would follow God. Now, as we come to the book of Ruth once again, and that's why Ruth is located in the Bible where it is during the time of the Judges. You have Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And it just tells about normal, everyday people going about their business. Now, normally I don't make too big a deal about people's names. When Joanne and I named our daughters, some of the names that we picked were because we liked the sound of the name, or we might have known somebody, or at least didn't know somebody that we disliked that had that name. We had boy names too. This was before we knew whether it was going to be a boy or a girl before they were born, and so we had names picked out. And I kid my daughters. I should have named them Russ Ann because I didn't have a son. But they said, "Oh, thank you, God, that I was a girl. Save me from Russ Ann." At any rate, sometimes people name their children names that have some significance to them, and other times it's just a name, a family name, a name they like. Sometimes, it means something. Well, so I try not to make too big a deal about it, but in this instance, it looks like the fingerprints of God are providentially upon this whole story. And so I think that it might be helpful if we looked at what these names actually meant. First of all, there was the name of Bethlehem, or Bethlehem. Beth means house, and lechem means bread. So here was the house of bread, but it didn't evidently have very good return on it. They had a famine in the land. This might have been exaggerated by the Midianite raids that came in. They would bring their cattle and things and just eat up all the crops. And so that might have been part of the situation, but they would go into another area where they didn't seem to do that. The Moabites had some grass and they had a way of making a living. So I don't know what they did over there. They didn't own land per se, but they did have the land area in the Bethlehem area, but they left it. So the house of bread, Bethlehem, had famine. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Then you had Elimelech. It has Eli. Eli Melech. Eli means my God, and Melech means king. My God is king. And so what does the man who has the name My God is King do? He goes to a country that doesn't worship God. So here he is, Elimelech, in the midst of idolatry. Then he lived there. There was Molech and Chemosh were the gods that were the gods of the Ammonites and the Moabites. And both of these were very licentious, treacherous, evil gods. And they would require child sacrifice. No wonder people who were sensitive to these things didn't want to have anything to do with those gods. And Elimelech had a wife, and her name was Naomi. The I ending means my. So Eli, my God, and Naomi, my, and Naom meant sweet or pleasant, my sweetness. So, here's my sweet. I call my wife sweetheart. Her name is Joanne, but I call her sweetheart. That's just always what I've done. And so Naomi was called my sweet. But when she came back, according to verse 20, she kind of renamed herself. And she said in verse 20, she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" Well, that was her perspective at the time. Little did she know that she would come back with a woman who loved her so deeply and would go to the mat for her and go out and glean in the fields and bear a child in the name of her husband and Ruth's deceased husband, and that she would have a family once again and be the progenitor of the line of David and eventually the Savior. So Naomi changed her name to Mara, but they kept calling her Naomi, I think. She had two sons, and this is kind of an interesting thing, is their names were Mahlon and Chilion. I would have to guess that they called those children those names because they just kind of liked the way they sounded. But what those names meant were weak and wasting, or some, similar meaning. So here's my son, weak, and my other son, wasting. I don't think they thought that when they said their children's names. But lo and behold, these two men married, and in their early adulthood, they died. Very, very curious. Then you have the name of the daughter-in-laws. The one who left her was called Orpah. Orpah. I think there's a lady named Oprah, and they had looked at Orpah wrong and inverted it so that it was Oprah instead of Orpah. But at any rate, Orpah, she went back to her land, to her people, to her father's house, and her name means stubborn, curious, curious. She had really wanted to stay with Naomi, and then she got talked out of it by Naomi. She knew there was a hard road ahead of them, and she wanted them to be sure uh, about their commitment. And she went back then to her father's house. Um, Seems like she was a fairly nice lady, but by contrast to what Ruth did, it seems to come out that way. Ruth, her name means friend or friendship. And greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for a friend. And this is what Ruth did. And then the next name is the name of Boaz. You don't see that. He doesn't come into the picture, so to speak, until chapter 2. And it says here, now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Kind of makes you wonder why it is that Boaz could make it and Elimelech could not. They both probably were primarily in the sheep and wheat and the crops that they could grow. Most everybody was kind of a farmer, and he could make it, but Elimelech evidently could not. And Boaz, I've heard his name variously translated. Quick readiness is one translation. Another translation is in him or in God is strength. Now, it's curious that during the time of the temple, now we have the tabernacle that was a portable worship center that God had them construct. And then David wanted to build a temple, and God said, no, maybe you can gather the materials, but it's your son, Solomon, that will build the temple. And when the temple was built, they had the proportions of the tabernacle, but they added a porch. And on the porch were these two support pillars. And one was named Yakin, which means God will establish, and the other pillar was named Boaz, which means God is strength. And so here was a man who either was a widower or had never married, and he was willing to stand in the gap and help out because at least part of his inheritance would be given over to whatever child Ruth and him could make together. And if he had any other children, they would get a portion as well. And so this was a man who was willing to stand in the gap. God is strength. And from this, we see in Naomi's misery and her thinking that nothing good could possibly happen. From one perspective, from her perspective, looking at it initially, she might come to a fair conclusion. Yeah, it seems like it's not going to work out. But God is working behind the scenes. As a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul, some 2,000 years later, well, that'd be like 1,200 years later, he said, all things work together for good for them that love the Lord. And he could have said this to Naomi. She probably wouldn't have believed it, but later on she would have. So God is working behind the scenes. And from this furnace of famine and funerals comes faith, friendship, and family. In fact, the most important family of all time. From it comes the Savior. And they had no idea how they were figuring into that. And you know, my friends, you might not think anything great's going to come out of you what you're doing, but you're wrong. All things work together for good for them that love the Lord. And even if you're going through a dark time in your life, it can eventually come out to have a good result. You just have to trust God through it. And as we look at the backdrop of the book of Ruth and all the things that are happening, we can see the hand of God and his plan going